This and other recorded webinars are available to WePass subscribers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So be sure to register through wepass.com to become a subscriber. Today's topic is titled Treatment Planning Systems Validation with MPPG 5, The Gift That Keeps on Giving, presented by Dr. Dustin Jackman, Assistant Professor in the Department of Human Oncology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Jackman. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Christina, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone on the East Coast. Like Christina said, my name is Dustin, and I'll be talking about Medical Physics Practice Guideline number 5. I'm really excited to talk about this topic. I think this practice guideline is really useful, and I think after you've implemented it in your clinic, you'll find it to be very useful as well. So let's get started. The overview of this talk today, I'm going to briefly touch on medical physics practice guidelines in general. They're not new anymore. Some of them are actually at their 5-year renewal periods, and so you'll actually start seeing some medical physics practice guidelines that have been renewed for the first time. That said, they are new relative to task group reports, and I think it's worth describing how they're different and what they're designed to do. The bulk of this talk will be about the general experience that I've had with implementing MPPG 5A, including some of the benefits and difficulties that I encountered during implementation. I'll also touch a little bit on small fields and IMRT. These are areas where the medical physics practice guideline are a little bit more qualitative, and over the years, I've developed some suggestions for how to take MPPG 5 and extend it a little further for these particular topics. And then finally, I'll discuss some of the developmental and organizational tools that my institution has developed over the years to help make this practice guideline a little bit easier to implement. So let's just talk briefly about medical physics practice guidelines in general. One of the tricky things about looking at the field of medical physicists as an outsider is that it's difficult to say exactly what constitutes quality medical physics practice. So there are people with interests like accreditors and regulators who want to be able to look at a hospital and its medical physics practice and say they're doing a good job. They've met our requirements for either meeting the requirements of the state law or meeting the requirements of an accreditation body. And for a while, states and accreditors started thinking about using task group reports for this purpose, but task groups were never designed to be used as regulations and standards for accreditation. They're really kind of a all-encompassing study of a particular topic that is designed to give medical physicists access to all the information that has been studied and acquired on a given topic for all of medical physics. And if you look at an individual task group, a lot of times if you implement every single part of it, it would take you 6 months, and you wouldn't be able to do anything else. And so the APM recognized that we need to offer something to medical physicists that explain to them exactly what the minimum level of practice should be in different areas of medical physics. And these guides would define exactly what minimum standard is for medical physics practice, and it could be used by accreditors and regulators to assess a medical physics practice in terms of whether or not it's meeting a basic standard. And so that's why the medical physics practice guidelines were developed. They're originally designed back in 2011. The first ones started coming out in 2013, 2014, 2015. One interesting thing about them is that they have a 5-year sunset, meaning every 5 years they have to be reviewed and renewed. And that gives the authors in the medical physics community a chance to make sure that these practice guidelines stay up to date, whereas task groups generally aren't renewed, and maybe a topic of a task group is only addressed once every 20 or 25 years. So medical physics practice guidelines are intended to be immediately useful and current, which is kind of a cool feature of the documents. So let's jump into medical physics practice guideline 5A. So what is MPPG 5A? Well, MPPG 5A seeks to provide guidance on commissioning and validation of radiotherapy dose calculations for photon and electron beams. The authors of this task group or this guideline had a number of charges, including identifying applicable AEPM reports and published literature that address this topic, providing updated guidance on technologies that are newer than those addressed in some of the earlier task groups on this topic, like Task Group 53, which doesn't cover IMRT and VMAT and other modern technologies. They want to provide guidance on what kind of validation tests should be done to assess dosimetric accuracy and what tolerance values and evaluation criteria should be used to determine whether something is clinically acceptable or not. And finally, they provide a checklist for commissioning so that everyone's kind of working from the same playbook. So this is a diagram that describes how MPPG 5A conceptualizes the commissioning process. There's sort of three distinct sections. Up at the top, we have acquiring data and modeling. So this involves acquiring commissioning data at a machine, doing some data processing and preparing it for modeling, and then finally generating a model using your treatment planning system. And this is generally done with not clinically relevant data. Usually it's square fields and rectangular fields, not the sort of things that you would deliver to a patient on a regular basis. The next section of the report addresses validation, and this includes validating basic photon, dose calculations, heterogeneity corrections, and IMRT and VMAT, as well as a comprehensive electron validation. And these are designed to build up toward and include things that are more clinically relevant, treatment fields that you would actually use in the clinic. And the last section discusses documenting your work, which includes, writing down what you did, what kind of detectors you used, how you analyze things, so that somebody can come along, a few years later, see what you did and reproduce it if they needed to. And then finally, there's some guidance on routine QA. How do you make sure your treatment planning system is continuing to perform at the standard that you would like it to? If you put all this together, this is what constitutes commissioning a dose calculation model from the standpoint of MPPG 5A. So let's start with our first question here. Which of the following is not covered in Medical Physics Practice Guideline A? A, beam data acquisition and modeling. B, beam model validation. C, ongoing QA of treatment planning systems. D, patient-specific quality assurance. Or E, all of the above items are covered by MPPG 5A.
Okay, great. Thank you. This question is up in the polls section. I see some of you have already started to put your answers in, so I just want to encourage everyone to do that since this poll will only be up for about a minute. And once you go ahead and answer the poll, feel free to ask Dr. Jackman a question in the chat for our Q&A session, which will happen at the end of this presentation. All right, looks like a lot of folks are getting the right answer on this question. I think we can go ahead and review the answer.
Okay. So the answer is D, patient-specific quality assurance. And I have a reference here for Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5A. It is true that in the course of doing Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5A, you might use patient-specific QA tools and techniques to assess your model, but the practice of doing patient-specific quality assurance is not one of the topics covered in the practice guideline. Okay, so you've downloaded MPPG 5A. I'll give you a little, I guess, story from my perspective. Back in 2013, I was at the spring clinical meeting, and I met one of the authors of Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5, and they told me about their work. The guideline hadn't been published yet, and they were looking for some people to kind of just kick the tires and see how the practice guideline will work in practice. And it happened that the program that I was currently in, my residency program, we were about to commission 2 new linear accelerators. And I thought, wow, this is a great opportunity to try this in the real world and see how it works and provide a quality benefit to my clinic. So I volunteered, and they sent me a copy of Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5A. So the first thing I did is I read it through cover to cover. Gratefully, most practice guidelines are pretty short, typically 15 to 20 pages, including references, whereas a typical task group, these days might be 40 or 50 pages. So you can generally read these in one sitting and get the, the overall feeling for what needs to be done. As I went through, I kind of made a checklist of all the things that I might want to do. In reading sections 1 through 4, there was guidance on beam data acquisition and the modeling process. And I looked through that and I found that, well, we have a pretty good commissioning plan as far as beam data acquisition and modeling is concerned. I think we're already doing all of these best practices. So I thought I didn't need to focus as much on this area. One thing that really stood out to me is that our institution didn't really have a great beam model validation plan yet. And so sections 5 through 8 really seemed like they're going to be valuable. And that's sort of where I spent most of my effort in terms of preparing for MPPG 5A. And most of this talk is dedicated to discussing those sections of the report. And finally, sections 9 and 10 are about wrapping it up, and that includes ongoing QA and documentation. And there's some great advice in there on how to do those things. So this is the big picture for validation in Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5A. You start with very simple geometries, static fields in water phantoms for both photons and electrons, and then you work up to more complicated situations. So you start with static fields in heterogeneous phantoms. In this case, we've constructed some custom ones. And then finally, you work up toward patient geometries and more complicated delivery techniques like IMRT and VMAT. So as I was going through the practice guideline, the first thing I did is I created a list of the tests that were in the validation section. Opened Excel and made a table and wrote down each test. And I kind of started to think about what equipment and tools would I need in order to complete these tests. And so, looking through, I saw that some of the tests didn't require any measurements at all. They were basically just sanity checks in the treatment planning system that were designed to make sure that things looked okay before we started with any measurements. Many of the tests were best done using a water medium or a water equivalent medium. And so I thought, using a water tank and setting up things in the treatment planning system for that, made a lot of sense. A few of the tests require heterogeneous phantoms. Some were just custom constructed, simple phantoms composed of solid water and cork, which makes a great lung substitute. And also it calls for an end-to-end external review test. And so you can go to the folks at IROC Houston and order an anthropomorphic phantom from them for that kind of test. And finally, some tests, because the beams that were being delivered were modulated, IMRT, VMAT, enhanced dynamic wedge, are best measured with QA devices, which can capture a dose distribution that's delivered over a period of time. So step 1, I gathered all of the phantoms and measurement tools that I identified in the previous section, and I prepared them in the treatment planning system. So in some cases, like a water phantom, you can simply make a virtual cube of water in the treatment planning system. Most treatment planning systems have tools for making water phantoms and things like that. For others, like this stack of solid water and cork, we took CT scans of that and put those into the treatment planning system. And we just got everything right in the treatment planning system. Step 2 is following the instructions of MPPG 5A to design fields and then calculating those fields in the treatment planning system according to the descriptions that are in the report. Step 3 is getting all of those measurement devices ready and taking measurements of those fields. That involves exporting the plans from the treatment planning system and either running them through the record and verify system or through service mode on your treatment machine and collecting various kinds of measurements. And then finally is comparing measured and calculated doses using a number of different tools. There are a lot of point measurements in MPPG 5A, and so a simple spreadsheet is sufficient to do those kinds of analysis. There's a lot of one-dimensional profile analysis that needs to be done, and so finding ways to do one-dimensional profile comparisons is valuable. For 3D dose distributions, things like film and diode arrays are really valuable, and so you can see that was a tool that we made use of as well. One thing I wanted to do is go through a subset of the tests in Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5A, just to give you a sense of what's in there. I didn't want to go through all of the tests because there's like 20 or so, and that probably would have occupied the entirety of this presentation. But I wanted to give you a sense of what they look like and kind of some interesting things that are specific to each of the tests. Test 5.5 is what's called a large blocked field. You can see here, I made a big M for, I guess it was for Medical University of South Carolina, which is where I was doing my residency when I first did this. I think that what I had in mind at the time was to create a mantle field type field, but of course we were doing this analysis on a true beam with HDMLC, so it wasn't possible to actually create a field large enough to deliver as a mantle field. So this is a small letter M. A few years later, I moved to Wisconsin and joined the University of Wisconsin, and so now we just rotate the collimator 180 degrees, and we have a nice W to use. On the bottom, you can see that we have a percent depth dose curve and a lateral profile. So this is the sort of data we acquired, using the scanning tank in this particular field. And you can see there's good agreement between the measurement and the treatment planning system for these particular tests. Some of the tests in Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5 are, they're just plain fun. As a resident, I'd done a lot of measurements, and one thing I hadn't done until I did Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5 was measured an oblique incidence field in a water tank. It's a pretty tricky thing. When you have an oblique incidence field, it's hard to define what is a PDD. Is it still going from top of the tank to the bottom, or should you go along the central axis? We did both and measured both, and it turns out that the treatment planning system does really well with either situation. But trying out these measurement techniques for the first time really was a great learning experience and a way to learn more about how our treatment planning system worked in different scenarios. For enhanced dynamic wedges, you have to get a little creative. Obviously, unless you have a linear diode array, you can't measure that in a scanning water tank because it's a dynamic field. And so we used the MapCheck 2 at Medical University of South Carolina. At the University of Wisconsin, we use an IC profiler. So there's different ways that you can do it. Measuring a PDD is a little bit harder, but you can just measure, at a set of different depths, 5 centimeters, 10, 20, 25. And if everything looks good for each of those, you can reasonably assume that your percent depth dose is being modeled accurately. This is a really cool test, not just because, you get to make a fun phantom, but because there's some really outstandingly cool physics involved. If you look at the diagram on the right, you have that classic heterogeneity correction physics on display, where you have a widening of the penumbra in the cork, which is a low density material. You have build down and rebuild up. If you're working with residents, this is a great diagram to show them and ask them about some of the dose calculation physics that are involved. It's also a really interesting test too, because if you want to create a really difficult test, you have to use a lot of cork. Otherwise, the heterogeneity correction isn't particularly big. And so we used, I think, 13 centimeters of cork, which is enough to change the dose by quite a bit. And generally, we found that our dose calculation algorithms are all within about 1%. So it shows that modern dose calculations are perfectly up to the task of this type of dose calculation. But you never know until you try. In test 7.4, it's kind of the first diving into clinical VMAT plans. We actually think this is the most important IMRT VMAT test in the entire validation suite. When we did it a bunch of different ways. So we used film, ion chamber, and our traditional QA methods. We think this medical physics practice guideline is a good opportunity to cross-check different measurement techniques, especially for IMRT and VMAT. Normally, we only use one for routine QA. And so it's a good opportunity to cross-check our routine QA method against other methods and really make sure that we can trust our routine QA method and that we really understand all the strengths and limitations of our dose calculation tools. One of the recommendations in Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5 is to do a third-party validation. The most common way to do this is to contact IROC Houston, which maintains a set of anthropomorphic phantoms for different kinds of tests. They have a head and neck one, a stereotactic radiosurgery one, a lung one that has a moving lung tumor. There's spinal radiosurgery. phantoms and things like that. So there's a lot of different applications that you can try. Here's one we did at UW a couple of years ago when we were commissioning 6 flattening filter-free photon beams. You can see that we're treating this left lung lesion. And one thing we did that was, I think fairly unique is we tend to boost the ITV, the internal target volume, in our SBRT plans to a dose that's about 20% hotter than the prescription dose for the PTV. And so when we did this test on the validation phantom, we mimicked our institutional practices to make sure that we were able to deliver those accurately. So not only did we do a test for validation of our treatment planning system, we tried to be as honest about our techniques as possible in fulfilling the dose calculation. So this in general is a really valuable thing to do. All the validation you do in-house gives you a lot of confidence, but there's no better confidence than having another institution tell you that you're doing a good job. So definitely avail yourselves to these external third-party validation tests. On the electron side, there's only 3 tests. I'm going to show 2 of the 3 of them to you here. Test 8.2 is an oblique beam incidence test. Again, there's a lot of really interesting physics involved in this one. Electron beams have some interesting characteristics when you deliver them obliquely. And measuring these types of profiles can be a little challenging, but it turns out that for some of the Monte Carlo dose calculation algorithms like those in RayStation and Eclipse, they're perfectly up to the task and they do a great job. One of the tricky things we found is measuring output for these fields is really hard because Dmax tends to move when you deliver an oblique beam. And so finding Dmax and making sure you have your chamber in the right location is really critical for these tests. Finally, we have test 8.3, which is the heterogeneity correction test for electrons. One thing that we did that wasn't in medical physics practice guideline 5 is the guideline calls for measuring the dose near the depth of maximum dose for electron beam in the presence of a heterogeneity. But it turns out that in the presence of a heterogeneity, the dose doesn't change that much, right? The heterogeneity will stretch out the dose distribution in the direction of the percent depth dose curve. So it'll either make it stretch farther or it'll make it stretch less far. But it doesn't really change the dose at the peak all that much, unless the peak happens to fall in the heterogeneity. So we asked another question in addition to, is the output correct? And that's, where is the 50% isodose line distally to the heterogeneity? So you can see that we have this high MEV heterogeneity point, which is more or less Dmax for this beam. But we also looked at what we would guess is the 50% isodose for each of 12, 16, and 20 MeV. And then we used solid water to actually measure where that was located. We found that in the case of Eclipse, we were able to, the calculations and measurements were within about a millimeter of one another. So that showed that not only is Eclipse getting the absolute dose at Dmax correct, it's also modeling the distal fall off really well. So we think that's a valuable variation on this test that's worth considering. All right, let's do another question. This is question number 2. MPPG 5A has tests, a number of tests that involve measuring PDDs and profiles in a water phantom. Which of the following measurement tools is required for these tests? A, ion chambers in a scanning water tank. B, 2D diode arrays. C, 2D ion chamber arrays. D, film in a water equivalent phantom. E, MPPG 5A does not specify requirements for measurement tools.
Okay, great. Looks like some folks are already starting to join in on this poll, which is fantastic. We want to make sure everyone has a chance to answer this question. And I see that we already have some questions in the chat for the Q&A at the end, which is fantastic. So I just want to encourage anyone else who might have a question on this topic to ask it in the chat for the end of our presentation here during the Q&A section. Let's give everyone just a few more moments since we still have some answers coming in, and then we can go over the results. All right, looks like most people have answered the question. I think we can go over the answer.
Sure. So the answer is MPPG 5A does not specify requirements for measurement tools. I'd say the most common way to measure a lot of the water phantom tests is to use ion chambers in a scanning water tank, but it's not a requirement. And they did this for a number of reasons. One, they recognized that a lot of people would want to do this efficiently and that maybe they wouldn't want to do it with water at all. And so they wanted to make other options available, like using ion chamber arrays and diode arrays. There's a practical reason why you might not just want to use a diode array, but actually have to use one, or I should say an ion chamber array. We have a view array at our institution, and as far as I know, there does not yet exist a MR compatible 3D scanning water tank. And so there's no way that our view array team could actually acquire 3D scans in a water tank for the view array because of the MR compatibility issues. So what they ended up doing is using a 1D manually turned tank to capture PVD data, and then they used a MR compatible ion chamber array to do some of the other tests. And so, when you're thinking about performing these tests on a tomotherapy or a Halcyon or another device that doesn't accommodate a 3D water tank, this particular practice guideline is designed to be very versatile. And so, with that in mind, the authors said, use whatever devices will let you do these tests, and just make sure that you get the types of information that we're requesting. But if you come up with a reasonable way to acquire that information that doesn't involve a water tank, by all means, use that. So then we get to the big question, which is my model good enough yet? And to help you assess that, MPPG 5A proposes a set of minimum tolerances and evaluation criteria for each test. And in the MPPG 5A report, these have very specific definitions. So minimum tolerances are widely accepted tolerance based on published guidelines like task groups, IROC dosimetry audits, or other publications. And they're considered to be, kind of consensus. Like there's a good feeling in the field that all dose calculation algorithms, all modern 3D algorithms should be able to achieve this level of accuracy. They're considered a minimum standard, but not a recommended stopping point for model improvement. A good example is the criteria for electron dose calculation, which is quite generous. And if you have a 3D Monte Carlo algorithm, you'll find that it's pretty easy to meet the tolerances for those tests, and that you might want to push your algorithms a little harder and see how well you can do. On the other hand, evaluation criteria exist where there's not really a widely accepted tolerance available. And this is generally the case for IMRT and VMAT. They're designed to emphasize areas of disagreement and highlight opportunities for further improvement and investigation. So this is what it looks like in practice. Section 5, there are minimum tolerances for every single test, largely based on the IROC Houston dosimetry audit criteria. The same is true for sections 6 and 8, which are the heterogeneity correction and electron dose calculation tests. And then section 7, which is on small field dosimetry and IMRT and VMAT, consists primarily of evaluation criteria, since there are not good consensus standards for what is best practice in those areas. So this is what it looks like to apply minimum tolerances in practice. On the left here, you can see the tolerances for profiles for photon beams for the tests in section 5 of the MPPG report. In the high dose region, they recommend a 2% local criteria. In the penumbra, they recommend a 3 millimeter distance to agreement criteria. And then finally, in the out of field dose region, they recommend a 3% global criteria. Here's an example of applying the evaluation criteria for MPPG test 7.4, which is for clinical IMRT and VMAT plans. You can see on the left, we have an anonymized patient with a clinical dose calculation. And on the right is the delta 4 measurement for that patient. And here we're analyzing it at 3% global, 3 millimeters distance to agreement, and pretty much everything passes, no problem. If we run it again at 2% local, 2 millimeters distance to agreement, we can see that there's an area of out of field dose where the dose calculation doesn't agree as well with the measurements. In this case, this is actually in the posterior neck, which corresponds perhaps to the area where the spinal cord is located. And so this might be an opportunity to go back to our model and make an improvement based on this information. A little bit more on why a 2%, 2 millimeters criteria is recommended. There have been a number of publications investigating the ubiquitous 3%, 3 millimeters gamma criteria and how it can be somewhat ineffective and hide some easily correctable problems. One great example is this paper by Ben Nelms and his colleagues. And what this paper found is they presented 7 different examples of where changing your dose analysis method or tolerances could easily identify correctable modeling errors or highlight weaknesses in the beam model. In general, the tighter the criteria, the more sensitive your measurements will be to changes in beam model parameters, so it makes it a little bit easier to tune your model as well. So overall, we found that MPPG 5A is a doable, well-organized approach to dose calculation validation. In the years since I did it for the first time, I've done MPPG 5A for RayStation, Pinnacle, Eclipse, and Mobius 3D, and they're all capable of meeting the tolerances specified in MPPG 5A for both Elekta and Varian Linux. And I guess I can add ViewRay to that list as well. Overall, the total time commitment is roughly 80 hours. About 26 hours involves time on the machine doing measurements, and the rest is preparation and analysis. That said, a lot of the MPPG 5A tests are actually things that you're already probably doing. For instance, about half of the time involves preparing, measuring, and analyzing IMRT and VMAT plans. And some of it involves the modeling phase as well. And so very likely, maybe the total time commitment for you will be closer to 40 hours. And if you're doing it for the second or third time, the time commitment drops by about a third as well, because a lot of the preparation work doesn't need to be repeated. So it gets easier the more often you use it. All right, let's do question 3. Which of the following describes why using a stricter gamma criteria, like 2%, 2 millimeters, is valuable during commissioning?
All right, great. Looks like a lot of folks are already jumping into the polls section to answer this question. And we're just going to give everyone a few moments here to answer this. And it's wonderful that so many people have already been asking their questions for Dr. Jackman in the chat. And we'll be going over that at the end. So if anyone else has anything they'd like to ask throughout the presentation here in the next half hour, please be sure to go ahead and put your questions in the chat there. All right, looks like most folks are getting the correct answer on this one. I think we can go ahead and review the answer.
Sure thing. So yes, the correct answer is D, all of the above. And this comes from that paper by Ben Nelms, which highlights a number of different practical clinical scenarios where using 2%, 2 millimeters is valuable during commissioning, because it helps you detect some easily correctable systematic errors when you're doing commissioning of IMRT and VMAT. So now I will share some of the benefits of Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5A that I noticed during my use of the practice guideline. And I'll go through each of these in turn here. So I'll start by, I guess, going by way of example and discussing the versatility of the validation data set. Back in 2013 was the first time I used Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5A, and it was used to commission the Eclipse True Implanting System for 2 new true beams. After that, we commissioned Mobius 3D for our secondary dose calculation algorithm for doing secondary dose calculations for our new treatment plans. And we did that for the true beams that we had just commissioned. And one of the nice things was that we didn't have to make any additional measurements to perform this validation. We had the validation data from commissioning the treatment units. And so we just used the same data and calculated plans using a new algorithm and did the same dose comparisons that we did when we first commissioned Eclipse. And we were able to assess Mobius 3D without doing a lot of extra work, which is really, really valuable. a few months later, we had an Eclipse treatment planning system upgrade. And after the upgrade, we just recalculated all the plans and reanalyzed them using Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5A. And without taking any additional measurements, we were able to completely recommission our treatment planning system dose calculation in 3 or 4 hours, which meant that we were up again very, very quickly and able to start generating new treatment plans very quickly. After I graduated from residency, I worked at a community hospital for 1.5 years in Beloit, Wisconsin. Before I had arrived, a group of physicists had measured all of the Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5 validation data. So when we had a Pinnacle treatment planning system upgrade, I was able to use that data set again to validate the new dose calculation in the new version of Pinnacle without having to take any additional measurements. And then a few months later, they bought Mobius 3D, and I was able to commission Mobius 3D using the same data set. At the University of Wisconsin, we've gotten 2 new true beams, actually 3 new true beams now in the last 5 years or so. We commissioned them in Pinnacle, and then a few years later, we commissioned them again in Race Station. After doing MPPG 5A in Pinnacle, doing it in Race Station was very easy because we had the same set of data that we could use. In addition, we have a ViewRay, and we've done MPPG 5A for ViewRay. And ViewRay is a fairly new device, and so the treatment planning system gets upgraded quite a bit. The whole delivery system gets upgraded fairly often, and so there's lots of opportunities to reuse data there as well. The summary of that is that the MPPG 5A validation data will come to define your treatment unit. It's sort of a encapsulated set of data that represents all the different clinical ways you might be using your treatment planning system for that particular treatment machine. And the nice thing about having all this measured data, that spans the scope of your use of the system is that you can just reuse it over and over and over again. So it helps define the scope of future model validation, which saves you a bunch of overhead in planning what to test. MPPG 5A tells you what to test, and you have this data set ready to go. A nice thing too is that it serves as a benchmark for comparing different dose calculation algorithms, whether they're new algorithms in the same treatment planning system or different treatment planning systems. And a nice thing too is that sort of by definition, MPPG 5A defines what a clinically acceptable dose calculation model is. And so this validation data set that you've measured constitutes a way of assessing if you have a clinically acceptable dose calculation model. So this particular set of data that you only have to measure once per machine can do a lot of work for you and save a lot of additional work in the future as long as you document it well and are smart about reusing it. Another valuable thing about MPPG 5A is that you can use it to find real weaknesses in your dose calculation algorithms. Every model has its weak points, and we've seen this over and over again when we've used MPPG 5A. So one thing we've discovered is that Eclipse Acura struggles with out-of-field dose, particularly at deeper depths. So at 30 centimeters depth, we see dose differences in the tails of around 3% or so, which is high because the dose out in tails is already very, very small. One thing we learned that we had no idea was there until we measured it was that in older versions of Mobius 3D, the MLCs didn't have a leaf offset table. And so the modeled position of the penumbra between the treatment planning system, in this case Mobius 3D, and our measured value was pretty different, several millimeters. And so we didn't know that this was the case until we measured it. But once we knew that, we were able to explain why certain plans had unusual characteristics in Mobius 3D. They've since changed that, and now Mobius 3D does have a leaf offset table. But this is one of the unexpected surprises we found doing Medical Physics Practice Guideline 5. One thing we struggled with in commissioning Pinnacle's 3D electron model is that it's really difficult to tune it over a full range of depths. And so, generally we tune it near Dmax and then accept whatever uncertainty there is at other depths, knowing that primarily we're going to be treating near Dmax. And the MPPG 5A testing allowed us to quantify exactly how well the model was performing in different scenarios and gave us a real sense of where the strengths and limitations of this particular dose calculation algorithm is. So it's a good way to get to know your algorithm in a really systematic way. And finally, every step of the planning and delivery process is tested by MPPG 5A, and that includes simulation and image import, beam generation and dose calculation, export to your oncology information system, generation and measurement of QA plans, image guidance and treatment. And the cool thing about this is that like your treatment planning system interacts with lots of different things, right? And by doing MPPG 5A, you'll be testing all of those connections and seeing how everything works well together. And this built-in end-to-end testing is invaluable because it gives you a lot of confidence in your tools and your techniques and really gets you ready for using a new system. All right, question number 4. After you have completed MPPG 5A for a treatment machine, you may reuse your measured data to perform all of the following except A, validation of a new treatment planning system for the same machine, B, validation of a dose calculation algorithm after a treatment planning system upgrade, C, validation of a dose calculation model for a different treatment machine, and D, validation of a secondary check dose calculation algorithm for the same machine.
All right, great. So this question is up in the polls section. Some folks are already weighing in. Just want to remind those of you who haven't had a chance to answer this question to please go ahead and do that, since it'll only be up for a short amount of time. And just one more reminder, if you have any questions for the Q&A, make sure those go into the chat so that we can review them here at the end of the presentation. All right, looks like most folks have had a chance to weigh in on this question. Dr. Jackman, I think we can go over the answer.
Sure. All right, the answer is C, validation of a dose calculation for a different treatment machine. So the thing that the other answers have in common is that the machine that is being scrutinized is staying the same. So a new dose calculation or a new treatment planning system for the same machine, you already have, if you've done MPPG 5, you already have data for that machine, and so you can reuse it. Validation of a dose calculation algorithm after treatment planning system upgrade, as long as you've done MPPG 5A once for that dose calculation algorithm, you already have the data to do it again for a different version of that algorithm. And finally, validation of a secondary check, a dose calculation algorithm for the same machine. Once again, if you've done MPPG for that machine, then you are ready to use that data set again on a different algorithm. The only one that's different is C, where you have a different treatment machine. Each treatment machine needs to have its own unique set of validation measurements. And so whenever you commission a new machine, you have to take another set of MPPG 5A measurements to validate that machine. Next, I'm going to discuss some of the difficulties I encountered while implementing MPPG 5A. One difficulty is deciding how difficult to make a given test. So when I first did this, I was a young, eager resident, and I really wanted to scrutinize the dose calculation algorithms that we were commissioning and push them to their limits. But sometimes that's not what MPPG 5A is asking you to do. Sometimes they're asking you to do a very specific thing and make sure that your algorithm passes for that thing. So one example is for these small field tests on the right, it recommends that you make a field that is at least 2 centimeters in every dimension, and do a dose measurement and a percent depth dose for those types of fields and make sure that things pass. And I thought, oh, I can do better than that. And so, right here, I made this one that's labeled C. I made a long, narrow strip that was less than 2 centimeters in size. And it turned out it was really difficult to measure this type of field in an accurate way, and that the dose calculation algorithm didn't perform as well as I had hoped. And so I had a failing test, but really the test failed because I designed it incorrectly. So I encourage you all to do both. Follow the descriptions of the tests in MPPG 5A, make sure that your algorithm passes, and then push it a little farther and really find out where things break down, because this is an opportunity to do both, making sure that your algorithm matches the requirements of the medical physics practice guideline, and to get to know your algorithm a little bit better and see where the limitations are. Another difficulty is applying the tolerance criteria. For some of the tests, there's multiple tolerance criteria for a given measurement. A good example is looking at a profile. We have high dose, penumbra, and low dose tail. different tolerance criteria, and doing this in an automated, efficient way is challenging. In a little bit, I'll discuss some of the tools we developed to help with this. But this is one thing that, when we first started doing this type of work and looking at analyzing these profiles, it wasn't immediately obvious to us how to do the analysis in a systematic, efficient way. One of the earliest tests in MPPG 5A requires you to reproduce your calibration, your Linac calibration geometry in your treatment planning system, and then calculate dose to the reference point and make sure you get what you expect. Essentially, there's an opportunity when you're commissioning a dose calculation algorithm to specify your output incorrectly in the treatment planning system. And this test is designed to catch that kind of error and make sure that your output specification is correct in the treatment planning system. Oddly enough, this test exists for photons in MPPG 5A, but they don't have an equivalent test for electrons. We think this is an oversight, and I hope in the next version of the guideline they add a test for electrons. We did one anyway, and so we looked at all of our electron beams, and we looked at the dose at Dmax based on the measured depth of Dmax, and we found that the treatment planning system can also calculate dose at Dmax very well for electrons and photons, but this is something that's missing from guideline that we think should be added. Finally, the order of testing in MPPG 5A is driven by the type of testing from the dose calculation standpoint. So basic photon, heterogeneous photon, complex photon, electron. But from a measurement standpoint, it's all mixed up. You use a water tank in parts 5 and 7 and 8, and you use a diode array in 5 and 7, and you use heterogeneous phantoms in section 6 and 8. And from a commissioning standpoint, what we really want to do is set up our equipment once, use it for all of the tests that require that equipment, and then put that equipment away and not need it again. That's the most efficient thing to do. And so when you're preparing for your tests, make sure that you're mindful of the order of testing and that you do things as efficiently as possible. All right, question 5. Which MPPG 5A test for photon beams does not have an analogous test for electrons? A, dose calculation at non-standard SSD. B, dose in a test plan versus clinical calibration conditions. C, beam delivery at oblique incidence. And D, heterogeneity correction.
All right, great. This is our last poll question for this presentation, so make sure to go ahead and put your answer in the polls section so that everyone can have a chance to see how everyone else answered. Also, we have a great number of questions in the chat, which is fantastic. We'll be going over those in a short while here during the Q&A, and if anyone else has a question they'd like to add, now is a great time to do that so we can make sure to get to it during the Q&A at the end. All right, looks like everyone is putting in their questions. We'll just give everyone another moment, and then I think we can go ahead and go over the answer. All right. Things are slowing down here. I think we can go ahead and review the answer there, Dr. Jackman.
Okay. The answer is B, dose in test plan versus the clinical calibration conditions. The rest of these tests, non-standard SSD, oblique incidence, and heterogeneity correction, there are tests for both electrons and photons for these tests. It just happens that for some reason, the original MPPG 5A doesn't have a calibration condition test for electrons. So over the years, discussing MPPG 5A with different groups of people, I've been asked a lot about what does MPPG 5A say about IMRT and VMAT and small field dosimetry. And there are some basic tests for each of these, but in a lot of ways, they're not sufficient to the way that a lot of our clinics practice radiation oncology these days. I feel like in the years since MPPG 5A has been published, the use of SBRT and small field treatments has gone up a lot. And so I'd like to give a little bit of extra guidance in addition to what MPPG 5A has to offer in these areas, because I think these are areas where the practice guideline might leave a little bit left unsaid. So for small fields, I think the most useful piece of advice that I can give you all is that you should test your model outside of the comfort zone defined by your commissioning data. Normally we commission with small rectangular fields, and we do everything on the central axis. So, look at small field PDDs for field sizes that are even smaller than your commissioning data. Typically, commissioning data goes down to 2x2 fields. So look at 1x1, centimeter MLC fields and things like that. Look at small irregular shapes, which are common in IMRT and VMAT. Look at off-axis shapes, which are common in IMRT and VMAT. When you do your dose calculations, use jaw positioning that is used for IMRT and VMAT. Typically, the jaws are more open than for IMRT and VMAT, sometimes very open for very large fields, but small segments. So, maybe simulate big open jaws and a small field within those jaws. Medical physics practice line guidelines recommends measuring down to 2x2 fields, but practically speaking, you're probably going to see smaller things clinically, so you should definitely test them. These two diagrams come from a paper written in, I think, 2005, so it's about 15 years old now. There's a paper about validation of IMRT dose calculation in Pinnacle. And there are a couple tests in here that I think are really valuable that I still do, because I think they serve as a good sort of benchmark for how well an algorithm is performing. On the left, we have this bar test, which is basically a series of bars created by blocking with MLCs. On the right, we have sort of a stair-step dose distribution created with kind of an IMRT dose pattern where each stair gets a little bit more dose. And baked into this, there's MLC transmission, small field dosimetry, leaf end modeling effects. There's a lot of physics involved in here. And if you can get your model to agree well for a test like this, generally you'll be on the right track for tuning your model for IMRT and VMAT in small fields. For IMRT and VMAT, the MPPG 5A has you do 2 clinical plans. I think practically speaking, that's too few. You should do more, and you should definitely test the full range of plans that you'll be using clinically during your validation phase. So think about small targets and your largest targets, special techniques like non-isocentric treatments, split field IMRT if you're going to be using that. Really pump up the modulation so that you can find a point where your algorithms don't perform as well. And again, follow the guideline in MPPG5 to do local dose differences and 2%, 2 millimeters dose analysis, so you can really see how your model is performing. And finally, know your model parameters, because a lot of times you'll be able to identify very quickly which parameter you want to change in order to improve your model. Here's an example of some of the anonymized cases that we use at UW, just different body sites, different target sizes, different levels of modulation. Really create a set of plans that spans the entire range of what you plan on treating. My final thoughts are, test and tune your model with simple small fields, and then start to validate with more complex fields. At the end, perform end-to-end IMRT and VMAT testing to complete the validation. And really, the final validation should be done with clinical fields and clinical plans, since those are the ones you're going to be using to treat your patients. All right, the last section here is about organizational and analysis tools for MPPG 5A. So I'm going to tell you about some of the tools that we've developed to help make this MPPG 5A validation process a little bit more efficient and a little bit more streamlined for our institutions, and about how you can get access to these tools as well. So one thing we created in the course of doing MPPG 5A for the first time is what we call the MPPG 5 profile comparison tool, which is a simple but powerful profile comparison tool designed to be used during the commissioning QA of external beam treatment planning systems. The program, which is written in MATLAB, accepts profile data from a scanning water tank and DICOM-RT dose files from a commercial treatment planning system. It co-registers the data sets and performs a 1D gamma analysis on the profiles. And the user may specify a number of analysis and export settings. This is what the tool looks like. And there's a bunch of different sections here that I'll go through. There's a section for importing measured data, which includes primarily what we use is W2CAD, since that's the default export format for Eclipse. We figure most treatment planning systems and scanning systems can accommodate this format, so it's fairly universal. We also have some support for vendor-specific formats, and I'm actually working with a group in Portugal right now to include PTW on this list. So we're trying to make this as useful as possible for everybody. The tool automatically determines the profile type and imports it accordingly. For dose calculations, it uses full 3D dose distributions, and it automatically extracts PDDs and profiles from the 3D dose calculation, so that you only have to export one thing for each field. There's a number of analysis options, different normalization tools for PDDs and profiles, as well as gamma analysis options. This is the output of the program. So you get these pictures of PDDs and profiles, as well as a gamma analysis underneath, so you can see how different parts of your dose calculation are performing. In addition, it also exports this data in Excel format so that you can look at gamma passing rates and things like that, and input those pieces of information into your reports. We also created a spreadsheet that goes along with it. So each tab is one of the tests, and then within it, there's a description of the test and a table for making point dose measurements, as well as a table for storing information about the gamma analysis that you do on the profiles. Right now, this tool is available on GitHub, which is a website for storing and sharing software. You can see the link here. If you're interested in getting it, you can go straight here and download it. Otherwise, you can contact me, and I'm happy to set you up as well. We have people all over the world using this tool. It's not super, it doesn't do a lot, but the one thing that it does, profile analysis, it does very efficiently and very well. And all these years later, we're still using it at the University of Wisconsin to do this type of analysis. And so we're very happy with it. It saved us a lot of time and effort. And if you're interested in using it too, just reach out and let me know. With that, thank you for your time. I appreciate your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackman, for presenting this webinar. We're going to go over to the chat now and scroll all the way down to the first question that we had at the beginning of the webinar.
Sure.
Which is, it doesn't seem to say anything about chamber array like IC profiler. I think
sure.
We're referencing the MPPG 5.
Sure. So the MPPG 5A is very open to all kinds of dose measurement tools. So a scanning water tank and an ion chamber is one way to do the tests that involve making measurements in water. But like I said earlier, and I think this comment came before I talked about ViewRay, for certain delivery systems, using an ion chamber array might be the most efficient and most appropriate way to make the measurements. And so for things like EDW or measuring profiles in solid water in devices that don't have great clearance for a water tank, an IC profiler is absolutely one way to do it. And I think it's a really useful tool, and I highly recommend it for some of this testing.
All right, great. Thank you for answering that question. Our next question, how much time should one expect to budget to do all this?
Sure. So the first time I did it for a true beam, and that true beam had 5 beam energies, so 3 unflattened and 2 flattened energies, and then it had 5 electron energies. So preparing all of that, taking the measurements and doing the analysis took about 80 hours. I included everything that we would have normally done as part of the commissioning. And so some of, if you're thinking like, 80 hours, I have to commission my entire LINAC and then do an extra 80 hours of work. It's not quite like that. A lot of the time is things that you're already doing, but now you can sort of like reorient that effort into MPPG 5A and do what you were already doing, but in a way that complies with the guideline. In practice, I would say, normally we're able to collect the data on the machine for these tests in like 1 day of scanning measurements and then 1 day of additional measurements. And then the analysis takes a little bit longer, but the analysis can be parallelized among many different people, so that saves time. And if you've got good tools, that saves time too. I would budget 2 or 3 extra days of measurements on the machine during commissioning, and then maybe 2 or 3 days of doing analysis the first time you do it. And then once you've done it once, it gets easier every single time.
Great, thank you for answering that question. Our next question, what do you do if a test fails tolerance?
Good question. So in the course of doing this, for the tests that have minimum tolerances, we've only seen one algorithm fail any of the tests, and that was the Eclipse 3D electron dose calculation. And that that algorithm is, it's not as good as some of the modern algorithms out there that are available for 3D dose calculation, like those that use Monte Carlo or macro Monte Carlo. The first thing you should do if a test fails is try to figure out why. For most of the tests, if it fails, there's probably something you can do in your modeling to improve the dose calculation and meet it. In the case of the electron dose calculation, we recognized that because of the modeling options, there were compromises and we couldn't make it accurate to the level that MPPG requested over the full range of the model. And so we just acknowledged we're going to have it as accurate as possible at Dmax. We documented that decision, and that's what we did. So the answer I would give is ordinarily you'll be able to improve your model and meet the criteria. But if you can't, make sure you've kind of assessed the clinical implications of it and decide what you want to do about it.
Thank you for answering that question. Our next question, how do you perform the measurements in the heterogeneous solid cube phantom?
Oh, good question. The pictures I showed didn't show an ion chamber slot. And so what we did is we had an ion chamber slot in there. We put it 4 centimeters below the heterogeneity so that the ion chamber was outside of the buildup region after the heterogeneity. That's actually one of the requests in the report, is that you don't try to make measurements in the buildup region because things aren't as accurate there. But that we would move around this ion chamber slot to different depths in order to get the measurements that we wanted. In the case of electrons, we use the parallel plate chamber instead, and so we just had a way of moving this parallel plate chamber or a cylindrical ion chamber to different locations and getting the measured values that we needed. You can also use other measurement devices like film or OSLD or something, but I think ion chambers for that test are probably the most practical way to do it.
Thank you for answering that question. Our next one here is, does MPPG5 give any guidance on ongoing TPS QA specifically for SRS planning systems?
MPPG5A does give guidance on ongoing treatment planning system QA, including what kind of testing you should do, what the frequency should be, and what to do after treatment planning system upgrades and things like that. It doesn't give any guidance specifically for SRS planning systems. For the most part, MPPG5A is designed to work for any sort of typical commercial treatment planning system. But like I said, for small fields, it kind of leaves something to be desired. And so I would think for SRS specific treatment planning systems, you might find that it's not quite what you're looking for, and you may want to modify or devise some of the tests, or devise some new ones that more specifically probe SRS specific questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Our next question here is, what is the difference between local and global for these evaluation criteria?
Well, that's a really good question. So local and global refers to how the dose comparisons are done during the gamma analysis. We have this percentage, right? 3% or 2%. And the question is 3% of what? 2% of what? And so when you do a global dose difference analysis, the percent, you're comparing your measurement to the global maximum dose. So let's say you take a measurement and it's off by 2 centigrade, and the global maximum dose is 200 centigrade. That means that your dose is off by 2 divided by 200, which is 1% of the global maximum dose. And so at that location, you'd have a 1% dose difference. And when you do a global dose analysis, by having the maximum dose be the thing that you're always comparing to, you generally get higher gamma passing rates because the denominator, which is the global maximum dose, is always high, right? It's the highest number in the dose distribution. And so using a global dose comparison generally gives you a higher dose, higher passing rate, especially in low dose regions where the dose differences are small because the dose differences in those locations are going to be small because the dose is small in that part. A local dose difference analysis means you, when you're looking at dose at a given point, you're comparing it to the expected dose at the same point. In high dose regions, that doesn't matter very much because in high dose regions, the local dose is usually close to the maximum dose because that's kind of how we make our plans. You know, we have uniform dose in a given region. And so the maximum dose is usually within a percent or two of the dose in the high dose region. But in the penumbra, and especially in the out of field regions where you're trying to protect organs at risk, the doses there are lower. And so when you're doing these local dose comparisons, the denominator of this comparison is going to be lower. And so you tend to see with a local dose analysis more failing gamma analysis points outside of the treatment field. And that's kind of what I showed in, let me see if I can pull up that slide. Let's go back a little ways, probably about halfway back. Here. So you can see that we have some red points in this 2% local, 2 millimeters distance to agreement. And most of them are out of field actually. And that reflects the fact by doing a local dose analysis, we're scrutinizing the out of field dose a little bit more. Local is a stricter criteria. And if your model is doing well on a local dose difference analysis, it's going to do well on a global dose difference analysis as well. The best resource for this is task group 218, which is a relatively new one on patient-specific QA. And they go into all of the different ways that you can analyze dose distributions and talk about that.
Thank you so much for answering that question. Our next question here is from David, one of our webinar editors.
Sure.
Hi, Dustin. Thank you for a nice presentation. I have a question. Patient-specific QA essentially checks the treatment planning process end-to-end. Can patient-specific QA be leveraged to assure that the treatment planning system is both consistent and accurate? I'm not suggesting it as a substitute for MPPG 5 guidelines, rather that it adds to one's assurance that everything is working accurately.
Definitely, yes. So there are some things that patient-specific QA doesn't give you. So most of the time for patient-specific QA, the way that you model the patient-specific QA device is, unless you're doing like film and ion chamber in a real phantom, if you're doing something with a diode array or an ion chamber array, very often you're not using a CT scan of the thing that you're doing a dose calculation on. You know, for example, for a map check, oftentimes you'll use a virtual water phantom. For the Delta 4 and the ARC check, there are virtual phantoms provided by the vendor that you use for dose calculation. And so patient-specific QA very often misses, some important parts of the treatment planning process, like taking a CT scan of something and importing it into the treatment planning system, applying an image value to density table, and things like that. Generally, patient-specific QA doesn't interrogate the model for heterogeneity corrections either. Most of our patient-specific QA phantoms are designed to be as homogeneous as possible. And so, we don't generally test heterogeneity correction as part of routine patient-specific QA. That said, I think patient-specific QA has a really important role to play in MPPG 5A. For one thing, patient-specific QA methods are super efficient. And so when you're trying to measure a lot of plans very efficiently, I think there's no better way to do it than with patient-specific QA devices. The way we do it at UW is generally we start with film and ion chamber, and we measure kind of a small set of really, really difficult plans with those and get the model looking really, really good for those. And then we measure a much larger set of plans using patient-specific QA devices just to check our work, so to speak. And so we use, some of the more labor-intensive methods to get started, and then we cap it off with patient-specific QA.
Thank you for answering that question. Our next question here is, can we completely ignore TG53 now and just go with this going forward?
That's a good question. When you're thinking about task groups and you're thinking about like accompanying MPPGs, it's good to think of them as serving complementary roles rather than one replacing the other. A task group is meant to be the authoritative, comprehensive guide on something. And will always be very difficult to implement in practice because it represents the best practices of everybody everywhere put together in one place. And really, like, no one institution is doing every single thing in a task group most of the time, especially one like or a task group 53, where if you really dig into it, you see there's tests on making sure that your digitally reconstructed radiographs have the right proportions and things like that. And really, tests like that belong to situations where you're commissioning, a treatment planning system that might be custom made or really, really new, such that nobody out there before has ever really checked into these things. But if you're doing a simple treatment planning system upgrade from a well-known vendor who's been making treatment planning systems for a long time, very often you won't go through the entire TG53 process. I will say this, that the validation guidelines in MPPG 5A are much newer and much more modern than those in Task Group 53. So as far as validation is concerned, I would say that that MPPG 5A supersedes Task Group 53. But there was guidance in Task Group 53 about non-dosimetric testing of treatment planning systems that I think stay very relevant to this day.
Thank you for answering that question. Our next question here is, how do I get the latest update for the profile comparison tool?
There's two ways that you can get it. One is to go to the, let me scroll to the end here. One is to go to GitHub, this link here, and download the most recent version of it. There's a zip file there with a Windows version of the software that's already pre-compiled, along with the spreadsheet for doing the organizational data management. You can also email me. I kind of have an email with like, hey, here's the link, here's the wiki that describes how it's used, all this information. So probably the best way to get it is to just send me an email. And that's, I think, probably the best way to make sure that you can get access to it.
All right, thank you. We just have a couple more questions here before we wrap up. Our next question is, have you used any of the plans described in IEAE, Tech Doc 1583? Thank
you, Mike. I'm not familiar with IAEA Tech Doc 1583. I know that the IAEA published some treatment planning system validation guidance. And I think they published it a few years before MPPG 5A. I want to say that it might be a reference in this particular practice guideline, and that some of the tests were designed based on what was recommended in Europe by the IAEA. But personally, I haven't performed any of those tests myself.
Okay, our last question here is, what is the difference between 2D and 3D gamma passing rates?
So that's a good question. Some vendors have tools that allow you to do a 2D versus a 3D gamma passing rate. And it kind of just has to do with the way that they do their calculations on the inside of their software. The basic idea is that if you have a gamma passing rate, if you have a plane of measurements, in a single plane, but your dose calculation spans planes above and below those measurements, you can do a gamma analysis one of two ways. One, you can just ignore all of the dose calculation except that one plane and try to find the points that are that have the same dose within that plane, or you can allow the search to happen in 3D such that the gamma analysis is allowed to include dose calculation in neighboring planes when it's trying to find the points with the closest matching dose. Normally, the best way to learn about how that's done is by looking at the vendor's specific materials. Usually they describe how their algorithms work and what the differences are. I can't remember if Task Group 218 discusses this, but that might also be a good reference as well. And finally, one of the best ways to learn about things like this is to do analysis with both and just see how it affects the gamma passing rates, and then decide as an institution or as a clinic which one you want to use and document that and make that standard procedure.
All right, great. Thank you for answering all those questions, and thank you for everyone who asked a question for Dr. Jackman. And I just want to encourage everyone to check out this webinar on our YouTube channel. It'll be available for the next 7 days. So if you need to review this presentation, be sure to check it out there. And we also have a lot of other recorded webinars that are available to WePass subscribers 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you can register through wepass.com to become a subscriber. And for up-to-date information about upcoming webinars, you can follow WePass on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you again, Dr. Jackman, for presenting this fantastic webinar. And I'm so glad that we had so much engagement during this presentation.
Yeah, you're welcome. And thanks everybody for taking the time to listen in. I really appreciate it.
All right, have a good day.